second speaker for today is Dr. Muhammad Ashraful Alam. Dr. Alam holds the Jai N. Gupta Professorship at Purdue University. And I am extremely fortunate to invite him today. And I was extremely lucky and privileged to have him as my direct classroom teacher when I was in Purdue University. Dr. Alam worked in the Bell Laboratories from 1995 to 2003. And he did important innovative contributions that overcame the technological bottlenecks in various aspects of semiconductor, electronic, and optoelectronic device technologies. He's a fellow of the IEEE, the American Physical Society, American Association of Advancement of Science, and his awards include the 2006 IEEE Kyo Tomasu Medal for Contribution to Device Technology for Communication Systems, 2015 Semiconductor Research Corporation Technical Excellence Award for Fundamental Contributions to Reliability Physics, and 2018 IEEE EDS Education Award. I'm inviting him to share his talk on the 5 facets of COVID-19 research and electrical engineers' perspective.
First of all, assalamu alaikum, and I thank Sajid for giving me this opportunity to participate in this discussion. And I'm also grateful for scientists like Dr. Kadri, who just spoke. People like him, or like her, is an asset to a nation, and we understand how great an asset they are only in the time of great crisis. And this is certainly a time of great need and crisis. So therefore, I just wanted to say how much we appreciate contribution for that she has made on in this topic, and also for the talk today. Now, I am an electrical engineer, and I also work in an university. So what I'd like to do is take a slightly broader and different perspective about the same problem. Nothing I will say today will immediately solve any of the things that we see around us today. But if we work on it, then hopefully, then in the long term, there will be fundamental advances made, and electrical engineers will have an opportunity to make a difference. When I moved to Purdue University almost 15 years ago, I wanted to make a difference, or I make a broad contribution. And instead of narrowly looking at the problems that I had worked on before, I wanted to look at the fundamental problems that people would be facing in this century. So I started around 2003. And so when I looked at National Academy of Engineering's grand challenges issues, then I saw that they have identified about 14 of these big problems, and you know them all. For example, the issue of energy, the issue of self-drinking water, global warming and security. But of them all, the healthcare turned out to be a fundamentally important problem. Because after all, the number of people in the world were growing significantly, and how to ensure the healthcare of this vast population so that they can remain healthy throughout their lifetime and remain productive is a challenge that is worthy of any engineer's attention, because engineers are fundamentally problem solvers. So therefore, whatever background I had as an electrical engineer, I wanted to see whether there is an opportunity to make a difference. And the motivation generally is that, you know, in electrical engineers over the last century have made great progress in terms of computing. When I was a graduate student, or when I was an undergraduate student at UT, the picture on the very left would show that, that their computers were very primitive. And today, the probably computers of 10 times that capacity in our cell phone. I remember listening to Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's speech in a small radio in Khulna at that time. And today, of course, we have significantly more powerful communication system in our phone. But in terms of healthcare, I saw that there is an opportunity. This is about 200 years ago, where people are still doing bloodletting. Although the machines have improved significantly in terms of scaling and other opportunities, there have not been as much progress made. The question is, can you do better? And the two problems I worked on before this pandemic was one was related to this issue about genome sequencing. After all, when somebody has a cancer, we associate it with an organ, let's say lung cancer or some other form of cancer, skin cancer. But long before that cancer has invaded that organ, there has been a genetic disruption long before that time. And if we could identify propensity of that genetic disruption, or from either from the family background or from the environmental factors, and if we could detect them well ahead of time, then that would be able to, we'll be able to perhaps prevent it, or at least do preventive measure well ahead of time. And I'm sure many of you know today that an integrated circuit today is one of the most important genome sequencer of our time. This has 300 million reaction beakers into this tiny little device, this maybe 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter. And I have done a lot of work on this topic along with my students. Another topic we worked on was this issue related to always on healthcare, because there are many features like diabetes, chronic diseases, diabetes, hypertension and all that requires constant monitoring. And yet very seldom people take their medication or can monitor this continuously. Questions are that whether you can have novel set of sensors, a novel set of sensors that will allow you to monitor and communicate with the doctor even when the patient doesn't really know that something is wrong. But then these are the two things that I think will continue to remain important problems even after the pandemic is gone, because these are long-term fundamental problems of human health that we have to struggle with. But then came the pandemic. The pandemic is something we forgot about in these grand challenges, because after the polio vaccine was developed, and in many cases, vaccine after vaccine essentially was able to eradicate many of the diseases that we knew, our grandparents knew in their childhood, we sort of thought that we have once and for all conquered them all. But if you look at the history, even from the religious text, and then just even the more recent history, starting from Black Death, which killed every other person in Europe, and probably 1/4 of the humanity completely about this time, because that time the world population was about 700 or 800 million. And this is started, by the way, the Industrial Revolution. And then if you look at disease after disease after disease, and in each case, you will see there was a preceding war, and that after the conquering army returned, they returned, brought along with them the disease, and that decimated the population of a huge region. For example, the 1918 Asia, the flu, the 1918 flu, that was related to the First World War, when the American soldiers returned from the First World War from Europe. In that sense, the COVID-19 appears to be a small dot, even after 9 times larger expanded scale. That is almost nothing compared to what it had before. But still, of course, this is a time of Facebook and news media and everything. So we know and care about others, big pictures, and death of every human being, of course, is a tragedy. And in that case, although the number of people who have died is smaller, yet the impact on this has been great. So I'll tell you very briefly about 5 things. I'm coming from both from an electrical engineer and a physicist perspective. And let me tell you a little bit about how different groups of electrical engineers can contribute to this topic. Many of these things you already know, because if you read the newspapers and various types of articles, then many of these things you know already know. I just want to give you an encouragement or motivation to think broadly. One of the first thing that is special about pandemics is that this is a communicable disease. This is something that spreads from person to person. And so therefore, this is something people have thought about, that this is going to be a big issue sooner or later for a long time. Starting from 1990s, there have been a significant amount of work. And this is a work in 1916 from John Hopkins showing that if there is a Nipah virus-like spread in the world, and you can see this is almost like the plane international airline routes and how it will spread. And they have been already warning people greatly that this is a disease that one has to, pandemics are serious concerns, and that everyone, health officials and politicians and engineers, need to take a great look at. Now, of course, this was a hypothetical situation, and this is the situation today in terms of the COVID-19. In terms of the issue about COVID-19 is that it's not that it is a very, compared to other infectious diseases, it's not that infectious, but the problem is that it has a long resident time, and asymptotic people can about the history, that how without knowing any biology, you can still make fundamental contributions. This is the cholera epidemic in 1854. And this is the Broad Street cholera out in this. What he found was, no, what he found was what he found that it can be all be traced back to a single tube oil. And the way, and this is therefore cholera is associated with it's a waterborne disease. And the way they proved it also, there was a mental asylum here, and the mental asylum had his own well, water well. And because that well, they did not get water from the normal tube oil here. And so therefore all of them were healthy, where people around them were dying. So this is a problem of statistics. And this problem of statistics and how things spread in a complex system is something is a natural for electrical engineers who work on the communication or information theory. In particular, you know, the person who has invented this, for whose work inspired the social distancing, is a 14-year-old girl, Laura Glass, who in probably 2006 or 2007, as a part of the class project, she discovered that sending children to school during a time of pandemics essentially would be a disaster. And so that therefore this was picked up by his father, who is a scientist at Sandia National Lab, Robert Glass. And everything that we know about the 6 feet distancing, the how different organizations should shut down in sequence, the opening and closing plans, all come from a 14-year-old child who essentially was just doing a class project. So you need to know no physics, just an intuitive understanding about what is important in a problem, and then follow your intuition and solve that problem. That's something I wanted to first emphasize. The second is that related to that, you have heard that Google and Apple and all other, many other organizations are now doing this something called a contact tracing. And the contact tracing essentially checks your cell phone. And if you had been in the neighborhood of another person, so for example, this person is infected, but you do not know it, or that person doesn't know it. This person has been in metro, it has been in office, has been in home, and had been in the proximity or vicinity of different people. And the next day, the person wakes up and sees that he has a fever, or he has tested positive for COVID-19 one way or other. Then what happens that everybody's cell phone that came within a certain range of that person's cell phone will be notified, and then that way they can self-quarantine, and facilities that he has used is decontaminated. Of course, there is a problem of how do you do it in a nation of hundreds of millions of people. What happens if somebody hacks into it, and therefore you get a notification, a vast range of people get notification that they have been infected, but actually they have not been infected. And the question about privacy, you don't want people to be knowing every second of where you are simply because for getting this notification. So here, an engineer has to work with the social scientists and others to see how to mitigate some of the social challenges. Not only an engineering challenge, it is also a social challenge or a social science problem, that how should people trust in a technology that is often not fully trustworthy. The second approach, remember I said that there are 4 or 5 approaches, so I'm going through one at a time and I'll be done relatively quickly. The second approach, again, knows nothing about biology, but electrical engineers can make great contribution to it. What you see in the left is just a thermometer, but this is not an ordinary thermometer. This is a web-enabled thermometer. That means that every time somebody takes a temperature, it logs onto this app, and then it gets aggregated, and the company is Kinsa Insights. And for last several years, they had been very successful in predicting the yearly influenza outbreak in different parts and alerting the health officials that how the influenza is sort of traveling across the country. Now, recently, I have been a part of a research work when we are asked to combine the thermometer, the cough based on a bandage on the neck, because the coughing associated with COVID-19 is a very special type of cough. It's a dry cough that pulsates the neck in a very special way. It's not a deep cough from within, at least in the early phase. And then the oximeter. Can you do the oximeter? Because oximeter is just 2 diodes, 2 photodiodes in parallel. Can you combine them all to track how different people are sort of getting, long before somebody knows that you have a virus or you need to be tested, your symptoms will alert people, or you can alert you to get tested. Once again, this is a field ripe for electrical engineers and computer scientists and information theorists, because this is something you can immediately imagine that how do you aggregate all this information? How do you use machine learning and other technologies to make sure that, let's say you have a fever, but your oxygen content is reasonable. Do you go get tested or do you not get tested? How do you get those information in a dynamic way is a great opportunity for engineers to contribute to. My third and fourth one, I'll go relatively quickly now. I do not know whether I'm well over time, but let me very quickly tell you. It turns out that all you need to know in order to make a contribution as an electrical engineer to some of these topics is essentially college level biology. Fortunately, when I was a student, I was forced to take biology. Not forced, I shouldn't say, because I studied in Dhaka Medical College a little bit, but then I moved to engineering. It turns out that a virus is a very relatively simple structure. Of course, biologists will disagree. Electrical engineers will simply say that all it has is an RNA, and it's an acid. It's a long chain of acids written in 4 letters, and then it's inside a capsule. And then, of course, you have all this protein structures. First, one thing I'll just briefly mention, that the physics or the geometry, why is it spherical? How many protrusion do you have on a spherical bacteria? Turns out to be a great problem in geometry. If you read this paper, you will see that this is related to Plato's original theory of solids, but it needs to be generalized in a very fundamental way. So even for fundamentals of geometry, 3-dimensional geometry, this provides a big problem. But of course, we don't want to call it beautiful today. We could have called it beautiful 5 years ago, maybe 2 years ago, but today I don't want to call it beautiful. That would be insensitive. But the thing is that inside you have an RNA. So this is something, once you have the virus within somebody, then you can check for the RNA. Do you have the RNA or not? Because there are other viruses for which you do not care about. Once it is in, then body also tries to have a defense mechanism, and that it generates antibody. Antibody tries to sort of lock into this and make it ineffective so that it cannot attack a cell. There are 2 types of antibody. This IgM happens within the first week, and then this IgG is a little bit longer term, in 2, 3, 4 weeks time you can see. So you can check for these. So either you can check for the signal or you can check for the response. And we have been able to do some work related to this. Let me just explain a little bit. So there are electrical engineers just know 3 things. They know that if you have a charge, you can convert it to current. Fortunately, RNA or DNA, remember it's an acid. RNA is a nucleic acid. So acid, when you put it in water, is charged. And therefore, a transistor can immediately sense that charge. And so therefore, you can detect RNA and DNA by using a transistor technology. Or you can change a chemical to current. For example, many of the pressure sensors or diabetic sensors in the eye, glucose sensors in the eye has this form. Or you can change, if you have a mass, you can change it to frequency, and you can detect whether there is a mass which has landed on a cantilever, for example. So let me just show you some of the work that we had done before. For example, here you see there is a platform. It is like a two springboards, like while people do diving, let's say. And these are extremely, extremely small. And what you do is that this is the RNA, let's say, from COVID-19, this black, green, and a gray colored one. So what you do is you put a complementary strand on the cantilever. And so therefore, when the RNA comes in and it hybridizes, it increases the mass, it changes the spring constant, and therefore it resonates in a slightly different way compared to this. An electrical circuit essentially immediately detects the difference, and thereby it can detect the presence of this antibody, of this RNA. And the big point here is that here you need far fewer, smaller amount of reagent compared to what we currently need for various reverse transcript PCR and other systems. So this would be a faster and smaller system, at least that's the hope. This is another way by using transistors you can do it. For example, once again, this is the DNA or RNA from the bacteria, from the virus. You bind it to a known one because you already know what you are looking for, and this has to be complementary. So A only goes to T, C only goes to G. So when you bind them, once again, the current from the source to drain, an electrical engineer would know this well, because of this significant amount of charge, the current will be modulated, and the modulation in the current will therefore be detected as a signature that there has been the specific RNA is present. I'll show you a final one, that when the RNA or the antibody concentration is extremely small, how do you detect it? How can you detect it immediately? Don't have to wait for 2, 3, 4 days before the virus has multiplied greatly. How you can do that? And in order to do that, what we have done is essentially combine two things we all know. One is lotus leaf, a droplet of water in a lotus leaf. And when the coffee evaporates, then the ring leaves behind. Combining these two features, you can make a sensor that has no precedent before in terms of sensitivity. And the idea is that if you have a set of electrodes, you put the droplet, I'm going through this quickly, you put a small droplet containing the antibody or the DNA and this complement. And as it evaporates, just like a droplet evaporates on a glass of water, this conjugation is detected by the impedance change of this. And this is exactly what I'm showing here. And that can also give rise to a very sensitive detector for the DNA. So let me wrap up. I told you about several ways that electrical engineers can be useful in long term. Because in short term, what the biologists have, microbiologists have, what Dr. Kadri talked about, this is the only option. There is nothing that we can do immediately to make a difference. But pandemic is not going to go away. It is going to, as it has for millennium before, it is going to come over and over again, unfortunately. And therefore, if electrical engineers take a long-term perspective, we can make a fundamental contribution that will help next generation, future generation of people. Second thing is electrical engineers are often afraid of biology. And what I want to tell you, that biology is not only beautiful, but it is the key concepts that are easy to learn. But the point is that at the end of the day, when you're doing serious work, you want to really work with somebody who has deep expertise. You cannot do it alone, but bringing in electrical engineers' perspective to these problems greatly expands the options that things can do. And finally, I'll end with a philosophical point that, you know, I look at this place, it's probably Kamlapur rail station. Every place, this is to be bustling place. People are empty, but the trees and everything, they don't care. They are just, blossoming as before. And here is a book that you should read. This is by Carl Sagan called Cosmos. And this is Voyager spacecraft taking a selfie of sorts back to Earth. And this is where all of us live. This is our home. And many times we forget how insignificant we are compared to the vastness of things. So therefore, all I should say that as we do all this engineering and all, I think the most important thing to do is slow down a little bit and be more kind to others. That's all I had. If you have some questions, then you can always, and if you want to work on some of this topic, you can send me an email. And I once again appreciate Sajid's invitation and opportunity to share. Thank you so much for your time.